Hi everybody, I wanted to do a quick video about this, which is a book called How to Be a Stoic, and its subtitle is Using Ancient Philosophy to Live a Modern Life, and it's by my friend Massimo Pigliucci and my colleague on the Modern Stoicism team. And Massimo kindly sent me a review copy of this, which I finally got around to reading, and I've done a little review of it. So it's a great book. I recommend it to everybody, and not just because it's Massimo's, but it's a really good introduction to Stoicism. He's got a unique voice because of his background in science and biology, evolutionary theory, and in scientific skepticism, and so it's a bit different from the other books on Stoicism that I've read. It puts a lot of emphasis on anecdotes from Massimo's own personal experience from his daily life and how he's applied Stoicism to cope with various things that happened to him. For example, he had his wallet stolen in the underground in Rome, and that really resonated with me because I used to work for many years in central London, and I used to see the pickpockets every day in the tube station that I got off at, which was Oxford Circus. I'd see them standing there. It took me a while to figure out what they were doing, but all the time I'd see these guys bumping people crossing the road and distracting them and stuff, and following people out of the underground because they saw when someone went through the turnstile. I realised what they were doing was that when someone put their travel card through, they would then see where, if they put it back in the wallet, which pocket they put the wallet in, so then the guys would follow them up and bump them crossing the street. And so that happened to me a couple of times. Nobody managed to steal my wallet in the street like that, but I think about 3 times. I think I had my wallet stolen twice and my phone stolen once in cafes, funnily enough. Some interesting things kind of happened actually when that was going on. Like once a gang of little kids tried to steal my mobile phone in a Starbucks. But I realised, look, this is kind of an inevitability, and the way I dealt with it was I saw it happen so many times, I just thought it's bound to happen to me eventually, so I kind of reconciled myself to it in advance. Like this Stoic technique of premeditating future adversity or setbacks, but also just the Stoic idea that viewing things objectively and rationally and deterministically, and telling yourself in a very kind of rational, philosophical way, look, there are pickpockets in the world, like there's a chance that this is going to happen to me eventually. I work here 5 days a week, for I don't know, like 10, 15 years, something like that, on and off. Eventually somebody's going to steal my wallet or my phone or whatever. These things happen. So Massimo has lots of these little stories about his own experience and lots of little anecdotes about famous historical figures, mainly Stoics, and also more recent people like James Stockdale, and he talks about Nelson Mandela and people like that as well. So I found the book interesting in that way. I'm always looking for material that I can recommend to other people who are new to the subject, and this is a book I would recommend to people because often people tell me they're looking for something that's kind of down to earth, it's practical, it's got practical advice, it doesn't get lost in the classics, it doesn't get lost in abstract philosophical theory. If you want that, there are loads of other books from which you can get it, obviously. So sometimes people complain because a book doesn't give them what they want, but they're like reading the wrong sort of book. So they'll read an academic book and complain it doesn't have enough practical advice in it, or they'll read a practical pop psychology or self-help book and complain it's not academic enough. Like, really, to some extent, that's a reader's fault for choosing the wrong book. But this is a book very much in the self-help mould, self-improvement. Massimo understands Stoicism, he's very familiar with the subject. You're in a safe pair of hands with him as the author. And he has he's really reflected on it in his own life, you can tell that. And he has some good advice in here. So it's a book I'd be happy to suggest that people read, maybe as one of their first books, along with Bill Irvine's book, which is called A Guide to the Good Life. It's also a book in Stoicism that's been around for quite a while now, and those are two really good introductory books on Stoicism. And they're also, they're both very popular books as well. So what I really wanted to do was not review the book. I don't really know how to do that. I've written a review. I wrote quite a lengthy review for someone that requested it, and there's a short review on my website. But what I really want to do is, I noticed at the back of this book, and this isn't so much a criticism, but I said in my review, some people might actually want to skip to this first, I think. Maybe that's just me, I'm a techniques guy. So I was like, there's actually a list of techniques at the end. There's a dozen of them. So I was kind of thinking, there's techniques kind of interspersed here, that's interesting. Then there's a big list of them, and a big juicy list of techniques at the end, which is what I was really craving. So that's cool. I just skip to read that first and then go back to the beginning. That's what I would do, but maybe that's just me. And I'm going to talk about the techniques because it's what I'm really into. So there are 12 of them. When I do these things, they usually take twice as long as I think they're going to take, but I'll try and be fairly brief. Some of them I'm not going to say a huge amount about. So let's get to it. Number 1, examine your impressions is the first one. And then each of these, he's kind of got a few pages explaining, but I'm going to ignore that and just tell you what I think about it. So first one, examine your impressions. And Massimo's probably saying similar things to what I'm going to say anyway. Checking what the Stoics really ask us to do, they tell us to do a bunch of things when they're talking about examining our impressions. And actually Epictetus at one point says that the goal of life, which is normally defined by Stoics as living in agreement with nature, there's a couple of other synonymous definitions as well, but Epictetus says something quite different at one point. He says the goal of life is making good use, or making correct use of our impressions. And I believe we have another source that attributes that to the Cynics, if I remember rightly. So it's kind of intriguing. Making correct use of impressions sounds like a definition of the discipline of assent. It sounds like a definition of what wisdom constitutes for the Stoics, basically. And so impressions for the Stoics are involuntary. Like, they're imposed on us through our senses, but also through dreams, through madness, through clinical depression. They're automatic thoughts, things that pop into our minds. And actually they may include feelings as well as pictures and maybe words that pop into our mind. They're basically automatic thoughts, or cognitions as we call them in cognitive therapy. And so the Stoics say these things are kind of inflicted on us, they happen to us by life. In life, but what we control is how we respond to them. It's kind of second order of cognition, although sometimes people don't stop to do that, so we have to examine these impressions. So I would say actually there's a kind of a step that comes before this, which is, in cognitive therapy we'd say, before we can evaluate cognitions, we have to be able to prise them away from reality, defuse them from reality, and view them as hypotheses. So rather than just thinking, you are a bastard, she is a bitch, if I fuse up with reality and I think you actually are a bastard, she actually is a bitch, then I don't have enough cognitive distance. I don't have enough detachment to actually be able to evaluate those thoughts. So every cognitive therapist will point out to you, the client needs to kind of prise these thoughts away from reality and realise that they're projections, to take ownership for them. Oh right, I see, I'm judging him to be a bastard and her to be, other people might view them differently. That's just my way of thinking, and it could be true or false. It could be partially true, partially false. It could be helpful, it could be unhelpful. But in order to evaluate it, I have to be able to see it as something I'm actually doing, as a hypothesis rather than a fact. And then the way that Stoics tell us to examine our impressions is, as Epictetus says, mainly, but not exclusively, in terms of whether they relate to things that are under our control or not. And what he means really is whether they involve placing value, kind of intrinsic value that's associated with the judgments about something being absolutely good or absolutely bad, and the emotions and desires that go along with that. So whether we're placing too much value on things that are outside our control is really the main question. So that's the first thing. Second thing, remind yourself of the impermanence of things. Marcus Aurelius mentions Heraclitus, the pre-Socratic philosopher, almost as much as he mentions Epictetus, interestingly, because he kind of largely as Marcus, largely as a follower of Epictetus. So where is all this stuff about Heraclitus coming from? Well, the early Stoics, we know, wrote about Heraclitus and were interested in him, but we don't really know exactly how much. Was there a sort of resurgence of interest in this, or is it continuous all the way through the history of Stoicism? Cleanthes seems to be interested in him, but was Zeno into Heraclitus? All this stuff about the impermanence of things comes from many different sources, potentially in Greek philosophy, but it's mainly associated with Heraclitus, who famously said, you can't step into the same river twice, which reminds me of the joke about how many Heracliteans does it take to change a light bulb? Only one, but you can't change the same light bulb twice. I'm not even sure whether that makes sense or not, but it's kind of funny. So life is like a river. Marcus returns to this imagery over and over again in the Meditations, and it's eerie, it's poignant, because he was posted at Carnuntum a lot of the time on the Roman legionary fort right beside the River Danube, this huge river that the Romans had a fleet on, and marked the frontier, natural boundaries like that often marked frontiers, and the war was literally fought across the river. The Marcomanni, Quadi, Sarmatians were on the other side of the river, and they'd often cross the river, and particularly in the winter when it froze over, they actually fought the Romans on the frozen surface of the river. So for Marcus, this is like a very vivid metaphor, if you like. He's literally looking at this huge river that his life revolves around, but he's also thinking what it symbolises in terms of the impermanence of material things. And thinking about the impermanence of things for Stoics is part of Stoic physics. It's also part of the discipline of desire, or discipline of fear and desire, as it's sometimes called, which really is the same thing as the therapy of the passions. We could call it the discipline of the passions. And it's a doctrine in physics, it's a way of looking at physics, but the Stoics believe that it has a psychological effect. They think it makes us less attached to things. We're less likely to desire things as strongly or feel them as strongly if we focus on their transience, less attached to things that we see as more transient. And in addition to material things which we might crave or be averse to, the Stoics also encourage us to think about the transience of other human beings. If they insult us, for example, like Marcus Aurelius talks about remembering that the other person's going to be dead soon anyway. In the grand scheme of things, what does it matter if somebody on Twitter has said something rude to you, apart from the fact that probably nobody else is listening? Like they'll all be dead and gone, in a brief span of time anyway. What does it really signify in the grand scheme of things? It's all going to be forgotten before long anyway. And also our own impermanence. Marcus talks quite a lot about that, as do the other Stoics. So the impermanence of material things, of other people and their opinions, and also our own mortality, all kind of interconnected ideas that relate to this idea that everything is in flux, the Heraclitean notion. Number 3, the reserve clause, which is a tricky technical concept to explain, but it's central to Stoic discipline of action. Marcus describes 3 aspects to the discipline of action. Oh good, I can remember what they are. One of them is that it's cool, he's got I love lists, as you can probably tell. He has this little list of 3 things that he thinks should be applied to all actions, and one of them is they should be undertaken with the reserve clause in mind, which we'll come to in a moment. The other is that they should be carried out for the common welfare of mankind, which is this aspect of Stoic cosmopolitanism and ethics, social virtue that a lot of people completely ignore nowadays, but it's really integral to the Stoic discipline of action. And the other one is that things should be according to value, kataxia, which means based on a kind of rational evaluation of which things we should prefer over others among externals and different things. So many people I think mistakenly assume that the Stoics just view everything external as completely indifferent. It's true that they do come across like that sometimes, but that definitely wasn't what they taught. We know that. And really one of the defining features of Stoicism was this idea of selective value or preferred indifference. In fact, the Stoics define virtue. We can see this in Cicero's De Finibus. Cato, the Stoic, is portrayed as saying, no, we're not like the cynics or the skeptics who say everything is completely indifferent. He doesn't like that idea at all. That's not Stoicism, he says. Lots of people today believe it is. They're wrong. But the Stoic virtue, wisdom, consists precisely in our ability to distinguish rationally between indifferent things. So while on the one hand not getting upset or overly attached to external things, nevertheless to be able to interact with the world in a kind of rational, sensible, prudent manner. So the reserve clause, which is the third thing here that Massimo talks about, means undertaking action while simultaneously. So we have an external goal, but we view it with emotional indifference. So it's easily explained by saying it's like having a caveat attached to every intention that says, I will go to the shops, fate permitting. So I plan to do X, Y, and Z if nothing prevents me. Chrysippus said that the wise man engages in public life if nothing prevents him. Seneca says the sage will go on a sea voyage, God willing, or fate permitting. In Christianity, the phrase Dio volente used to be used at the end of letters, which means God willing. And inshallah means the same thing as I understand it in Arabic and Islam. So Stoics undertake everything with this kind of inshallah, Dio volente, God willing, kind of caveat attached. And really, that's very much tied up with the idea of preferred indifference. So we have a goal, but it's nevertheless, it's preferred, but we place value on it, axia, but we don't treat it as if it's intrinsically good to the extent that we'd actually get upset if we were deprived of it. And it's also tied up with premeditation, because to do that, in a sense, means anticipating setbacks and failure and being willing to accept those with equanimity. Number 4, how can I use virtue here and now? Again, when I talk to people about Stoicism, this is something that they seldom mention, but if you read Marcus Aurelius, he mentions this over and over and over and over again, and you can see it in the other Stoics as well. Like, it's one of the main fallback techniques that we find in the Roman Stoics anyway. It probably goes right all the way through the history of Stoicism, I guess. And it's an interesting technique. It's a way of connecting with virtue, reminding ourselves of virtue. I find it in practice closely bound up with role modelling, to ask myself how I could act wisely or with courage. Moderation in a situation is kind of like requires, or often it involves thinking about how other people might handle the same situation who have more of those qualities. And it also means thinking about our potential, our kind of own inner untapped potential. Like, could I be doing better here? Could I excel more? What virtues do I have? Does this require patience? I know what patience looks like. I know what it tastes like and feels like and how it works. I can do patience. It's not an alien concept to me. If I take a step back from it, do I think the situation calls for patience? In which case then, maybe I can try and get into that mode of functioning. And also thinking about, what would I expect other people to do in this situation? Number 5, pause and take a deep breath. waiting for strong emotions to abate naturally rather than acting rashly when we're upset. This is the gloss that I would put on that anyway. This is a really important technique in Epictetus in the discipline of desire, which he thinks is the first thing his students should master before they get into the more theoretical parts of Stoicism. And this technique is also attributed to Platonists and particularly the Pythagoreans. I believe the Pythagoreans had a special term for it, which I've forgotten for the time being. It's called paidartan, if I remember rightly. That's when they criticise someone after they've calmed down, if I remember rightly. So punishing a servant or a slave, but only after your feelings have abated and you're not actually angry anymore. I think I'm right there. But Epictetus says in general when we're upset, and this is so consistent with modern cognitive therapy, we would say when the anxiety mode is activated, when cognitive schemas are activated, you can't easily think straight, you can't engage in cognitive reappraisal or problem solving very easily, so sometimes it's better to wait until the feelings have abated and that mode has been deactivated, to use the current terminology. And then we're more able to kind of reevaluate, to think about role modelling, to think about problem solving, to ask ourselves what's under our control and what isn't. Although with practice, it's easier to do it in the heat of the moment. People often say, the first thing people say in therapy is, when I get upset, it all goes out the window. And the therapist goes, yeah, that's normal. And we call that normalising. You're the same as everyone else in that regard. And guess what? Over like hundreds of thousands of therapy sessions, therapists have kind of figured out various ways. There's 3 or 4 fundamental strategies that we use to help people to deal with that. But one of them is just waiting, which is what Epictetus talks about doing. And then once the skills become more familiar and deeper cognitive change happens, then you'll find yourself responding differently or changing direction more easily, more quickly in the heat of the moment. But to begin with, it's a good idea just to wait until the feelings abate naturally and then do your problem solving. So if you're really angry, for example, you might wait hours, or until the next day, even until you've calmed down, and then think about what would be a more constructive thing to say rather than just an aggressive or angry thing to say. And then that allows you potentially to be more assertive rather than aggressive. Number 6, otherize, which is not a phrase I use, but it's reasonable enough. It's a good little neologism there. Getting beyond personalisation, I think, is what Massimo and Greg, who also contributed to this, Greg Lopez, I think what they have in mind is what I would call overcoming personalisation, the cognitive bias, by considering how we'd feel about our misfortunes if they befell another person. This is a recurring theme in Stoicism as well. It's in Socrates as well. He makes a lot of use of something we call in therapy the double standard strategy, which is imagine how you would view this if it happened to someone else. Again, harking back to something I said earlier. I'm going to do that a few times because all these techniques are interconnected. So when I think about how I would cope with a situation, I'll instinctively think, well, what about someone I admire or the ideal sage? How would they cope with it? But part of it also thinking about facing adversity. If it happened to someone else, would I think they're making a big fuss about it? It'll be over before long anyway. It's not really worth getting upset about. When you're in a relationship and it comes to an end, I'm thinking of many clients I've seen over the years, it kind of seems like the most tragic, terrible thing in the world, but it's difficult sometimes to talk to your friends about it because everybody else has had relationship breakups as well. Like, most other people have been bereaved at some point as well. Everybody, these kind of negative experiences are more common than we normally have at the forefront of our mind anyway, because people don't talk about them all that much or share their feelings about it that much. So it creates an illusion that they're kind of more special or more unusual than they actually are. And so in relationship breakups, people often magnify the significance of it in a way, and that's why it makes it quite annoying when you try and talk to your friends and they're kind of like, yeah, you'll be over it in a few weeks, just meet someone else, you'll be fine, which is probably true in many cases, but it's not necessarily easy for people to hear that. But then if they imagine kind of swapping roles, and they might think, well, actually, when my buddy split up with his girlfriend, or when he got divorced or whatever, I guess I was probably saying the same sort of thing to him. I was just kind of like, yeah, it's not really the end of the world, like kind of trying to be empathic and stuff, but really it's, he's going to get over it. These things happen. It's just part of the normal course of life. The point being that we don't apply the same standard to other people's problems that we apply to our own. Our own problems might seem much more catastrophic than other people's problems do. And so shifting between first and third party perspectives is very useful in therapy. It helps us to gain a certain amount of objectivity. We can at least ask ourselves the question, why shouldn't I view this the way that I would view if it was happening to one of my friends? Personalising it less. Number 7, speak little and well. I think Massimo says something about that's tricky because he's a teacher. For many years I trained psychotherapists. I had to talk for like 8 hours a day for 7 days a week, sometimes for 21 days in a row. And believe it or not, I'm a lot more chilled now. I've kind of moved on to other things now, but if you're a teacher, it's difficult to speak little and well, to be laconic, because you're often used to being in a situation where you have to speak for hours about a subject and fill the gaps in and stuff. So hands up, that's probably something that I would have to confess that I need to work on. I think Massimo says something similar as well. Being Scottish doesn't help either. So speak little and well. The Stoics were known for speaking laconically. Actually, Cicero says of Cato that he and his friends, the Stoics, speak like Spartans. So he just straight up says, you guys speak laconically, you sound like Spartans. And certainly, you could guess that from the association between brevity of speech and Stoicism. And their kind of flirtations with Spartan culture, their interest in Sparta. Zeno reputedly said, the founder of Stoicism, someone complained to him that his philosophical arguments were notoriously abrupt. They were short syllogisms, maybe good for memorization, but not really very convincing arguments. They were too abrupt, too short, too simple. We have a few examples of them actually in Epictetus and in Seneca. And Zeno said, yeah, if I could make the syllables shorter, I'd do that as well. So he really wanted to kind of abbreviate things and make it as pithy, memorable as possible. I think maybe there's a psychological advantage to that. What I'd say about that is that in therapy we usually train clients to create coping statements, and they usually have to be fairly concise to be impactful. So they kind of condense usually a lot of understanding, a lot of meaning into a short phrase, like an aphorism. I believe it's called accumulation in rhetoric, actually. When they're not just pulled out of thin air, they have to be meaningful to the person, and sometimes it comes as a result of a lot of other therapy they've been doing, and it culminates in a conclusion that they can sum up in a word or a phrase and then recall in the heat of a moment. I said earlier, there are a number of ways which we help people to cope with situations where their anxiety mode is activated. And one is by using coping statements, because they're short and memorable, and if they're prepared to use them properly, they can be effective, but they have to usually be laconic or concise. Choose your company well. Choose your friends well. That is a recurring theme in classical literature. I don't know if I've got a lot to add to that in particular. There's a kind of idealistic view of friendship. It's very different in some ways from the modern view of friendship in classical philosophy and Greek philosophy. But they're very sensitive to this idea that the people that you surround yourself with will influence your character, and I think that's as true today as it was in the past. Although the difference is now that many people spend more time talking to strangers on the internet than they do actually talking to real people. So you might say, choose your things that you read online well as well. It's different now, but relevant in a different sort of way. We have these kind of social media bubbles and things now, so it's this is the same issue, really. We're being brainwashed by the people that we surround ourselves with if we're not careful, or the social media groups that we join. Respond to insults with humour, number 9. I don't know that the Stoics really do that all that much. They do it a bit. They do have a sense of humour. As I like to say, Chrysippus allegedly died laughing at one of his own jokes about a donkey. It wasn't even a good joke. Sometimes it's hard to tell because humour, verbal humour, puns don't translate as well through through from one culture to another over the ages as tragedy transfers a lot better. So sometimes the Stoics are maybe making jokes, or other philosophers are making jokes that kind of go over our heads a little bit. We don't even realise it is humour. And sometimes they say things that look like jokes, but maybe they're intended seriously. This is more of a problem with Socrates, who often it's difficult to tell whether he's joking or half joking or whether he's actually serious. But I think it's sound advice to respond to insults with humour. Number 10, don't speak too much about yourself. That's an interesting one because some therapists say the opposite. There's a thing called I talk in therapy, and particularly the founder of assertiveness training, a behaviourist called Andrew Salter, in the 1940s, started off this idea of I talk that hung around for a while. It still exists in the therapy field. That people who lack assertiveness don't use the word I as much as they potentially could, because it's a kind of form of avoidance in a way, rather than saying I think. It takes a certain amount of confidence to do that. And non-assertive people, anxious, inhibited people, sometimes actually avoid using the word I. So, and they don't like to reveal much of themselves because they feel vulnerable doing so. So sometimes speaking about yourself actually could be a sort of an important part of assertiveness and confidence, almost like shame attacking. I don't know that I think that features that prominently in the Stoics. Actually, I can't remember if Massimo refers to a particular passage. But there are certainly, for many people, they talk about themselves too much. So some people, that's definitely going to be sound advice. Number 11, speak without judging, just stick to the facts and remain objective. Cut the crap, stick to the facts, be matter of fact. This is actually one of my favourite pieces of advice. It's got to do with this idea of fantasia cataleptica, the representation that grasps reality, or a grasping representation. It's sometimes called objective representation. It really is partly a concept in Stoic epistemology, but there's also techniques that are closely related to it, and bound up again with Stoic physics, which seems to, like the modern scientific method, have this idea of describing things in a matter-of-fact, objective, scientific manner. And we have this metaphor again in modern therapy that we encourage clients to take a step back and view their own thoughts, their inner life and their behaviour with the objectivity of a third party or a scientist observing things, to treat themselves as if they're conducting a scientific observation on themselves, as a way of gaining a kind of detachment. But for Stoics, this really is one of the most important techniques. It's interesting because I see people in Stoic groups a lot getting quite angry about stuff and arguing and kind of insulting each other and stuff online, as everybody does. It's all fun and games. Welcome to the internet. But one of the most basic Stoic techniques, really, one of the most common things that runs through the Stoic literature is this idea of not imposing strong value judgments on externals, including other people on the internet. And part of that is not using emotive language or value judgments, so not calling people idiots or fascists or stuff like that. That's not a Stoic thing to do, basically. And I'm sure there are exceptions where the Stoics did do things like that, but generally speaking, they advise us to, especially if we're becoming too angry or too upset about things, we should just take a step back and describe things more objectively. What strikes me is often people don't seem to realise that they're using emotive language or value judgments. And in therapy it's really obvious. And you kind of have to deal with that first. You can't really do much else until someone stops calling someone a bastard or a bitch or an idiot or a fascist. You can't even really begin doing therapy, arguably, in a sense, until you get them to realise those are value judgments, and that's what's making you angry, right? Like, you're going to probably have to question those. You're going to have to gain some cognitive distance from them. Like, you're going to continue to be angry, in other words, as long as you keep calling this other person a fascist or a bitch or whatever. You know, how could it be otherwise? The way I think of it is we use rhetoric precisely to evoke emotions in our listeners. That's kind of what rhetoric evolved for, and it's part of daily life that we manipulate other people's emotions when we're talking to them. But isn't it crazy to do it to yourself? Isn't it kind of crazy to use rhetoric in your own mind, in your own thinking, to evoke strong emotions in yourself? If that's a problem for you, then you should do Stoic rhetoric, which was often kind of viewed as a sort of anti-rhetoric or a counter-rhetoric. It's a rhetoric that consists in not using value judgments or emotive language, exaggeration, sticking to the facts like a scientist. And finally, number 12, reflect on your day by reviewing events each evening in a constructive and dispassionate manner, looking for areas in which you can improve. My lamp has started buzzing recently and I have to hit it. It stops. Okay. Yeah, this is also one of the most important and recognisable Stoic techniques. It's kind of there really clearly in the golden verses of Pythagoras. Seneca mentions it, Epictetus mentions it. They both quote the golden verses of Pythagoras, if I remember rightly. Does Marcus mention it? I can't remember now. But it seems to be an important part of Stoicism. Galen mentions it in his description of Stoic therapy. It's one of the less well-known pieces of writing about Stoicism that survive today. The Diagnosis and Cure of the Soul's Passions by Galen, which is kind of eclectic, but it's partly inspired by the Stoic therapeutic literature, particularly the Therapeutics of Chrysippus. And Galen says he actually used to read aloud twice a day the golden verses of Pythagoras, which include this advice each evening to review everything that's happened to you 3 times. Now, there are some accounts that suggest this Pythagoreans did that in order to improve their memory, but the Stoics do it as a kind of Socratic exercise, as a way of cross-examining themselves, as Socrates put it, questioning their own behaviour as a form of moral examination. And Seneca beautifully puts the point across, which is absolutely integral, that it shouldn't be aggressive. We see that even in the Socratic literature as well, this idea that, you know, obviously cross-examination sounds aggressive, but it shouldn't be, you know, Socrates didn't do it in an aggressive manner. He was very polite about doing it, and he was very likeable. You know, he's nice, he was friendly in the manner that he did it, even though it was a very challenging thing. Like a modern therapist today has to ask difficult questions, but they have to have warmth and empathy in doing it, otherwise they're just going to alienate the client. In the same way, when we're doing this in our own mind in the evening, we have to be like a friend to ourselves, and that's kind of how Seneca describes it. He says he's not harsh with himself when he's cross-examining his behaviour, questioning his motives, you know, criticising things that he did or things that he failed to do. It's really just a way of learning from our experience. Like the 3 main questions that we should ask are, what did I do wrong? Like, what did I do that I shouldn't have done, that it was done badly? What did I fail to do? What did I forget to do? What did I miss out? And what can I learn? What should I do differently next time, i.e. tomorrow or the day after? Like, how can I learn from this and move forward? So those are the 12 things. I'll recap on them briefly and then I'll finish for today, because I just wanted to have a bit of a ramble, but I know you guys like practical techniques, so I hope that you found that useful. Number 1, examine your impressions, checking whether they're placing too much value in external things that are beyond your direct control. It's a recipe for neurosis. Number 2, remind yourself of the impermanence of things, material things, other people and their opinions, but also your own life. Number 3, undertake all actions with the reserve clause, according to value and for the common welfare of mankind. Number 3, undertake all actions with the caveat, I will do this, fate permitting, or if nothing prevents me. Number 4, ask yourself, what virtues are there that could help me to deal better with this situation? What resources do I have that I can call upon? Number 5, pause, take a deep breath, wait for strong emotions to abate naturally, rather than acting rashly when you're in the grip of a passion. Number 6, otherize. Think about the double standard strategy. How would you view this differently if it's some misfortune that happened to you? If it were happening to another person, do you apply a different standard to yourself and other people? 7, speak little and well. Try to be laconic, at least I think in your thinking, and maybe relate that to the idea of coping statements in particular, and the changes that you want to make. Try and make them concise, aphoristic. 8, choose your company well, including online. 9, respond to insults with humour. 10, don't speak too much about yourself. Maybe in some situations do speak about yourself if that's something that's required for personal growth. Number 11, speak without judging, just stick to the facts, remain objective. So, create in your mind an objective representation. As Marcus said, his sacred imperial robes are just sheep's wool dyed in putrid shellfish guts. And Napoleon said a throne is just a bench covered in velvet. Be down to earth about things. Don't allow rhetoric and emotive language and value judgments to drive you crazy. And number 12, each evening, like the Pythagoreans recommend, reflect on what you've done during the day, what you did badly, what you did well, actually, and what you failed to do, what you missed out, and how you could improve and do better next time. Okay, I hope that you found that useful. I won't go on forever, so I'm just going to wrap things up there. If you have any questions, as always, feel free to get in touch. But for now, bye.